The story begins with a young girl named Sarah, who, unlike many other children her age, was quiet, introspective, and had a deep sense of curiosity. At just 16 years old, Sarah had already experienced the kind of loss that made her grow up too quickly. Her mother had passed away when she was only 7, and since then, Sarah had been raised by her father, who worked long hours as a librarian in their small town. Sarah spent most of her time in their cozy home, surrounded by books. Books became her refuge, her way of escaping the world around her and immersing herself in stories that she could only dream of living. Sarah was a dreamer, often found with her nose in a book or gazing out her bedroom window at the rolling hills that surrounded their town. Though she had many friends at school, she felt different from them. While they were focused on the latest trends and social circles, Sarah was more interested in the mysteries of the world, things like old legends, ancient languages, and the possibility that there was something more beyond the boundaries of the life she knew. Her father, though kind and gentle, had never been able to fully understand her dreams. He was a practical man, dedicated to the day-to-day responsibilities of their small family. However, he often indulged her in her pursuits, bringing home books from the library and encouraging her love for reading, even if he didn't entirely grasp her fascination with the unknown. Sarah's world was small, but it was a place she had grown comfortable in. The town of Glenwood was nestled in a valley surrounded by thick forests and misty mountains. The streets were narrow, and the buildings were old, with cobblestone paths that led to every corner. It was a peaceful place, where everyone knew each other's names, and the days seemed to drift by quietly. Yet, even in such a tranquil setting, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to life than what she had known. It was on one particularly dull afternoon, when the clouds hung low in the sky and a gentle rain pattered against her window, that Sarah's life would change forever. She had spent the day rummaging through the attic of her house, a place she had always found fascinating. The attic was a treasure trove of forgotten things, old furniture, dusty boxes, and half-empty trunks filled with relics from her mother's past. It was a place that Sarah had always wanted to explore more deeply, though she hadn't dared to venture too far into its hidden corners until this rainy day. Her father had always warned her not to touch the old trunks, telling her that they contained items that belonged to her mother's side of the family, people Sarah had never known. But Sarah's curiosity had long since surpassed the bounds of her father's rules. On that day, she found herself digging through a particularly large trunk that had been pushed into the farthest corner of the attic, its surface scratched and weathered by years of neglect. As she opened the trunk, a faint, musty smell escaped, mingling with the dampness of the rain outside. Inside, there was a mix of things: old clothes, faded photographs, and handwritten letters. But what caught her attention was a small, worn, leather-bound book. It was unlike any book she had ever seen before. Its cover was plain, with no title or markings, and the edges of the pages were yellowed with age. She ran her fingers along the spine, feeling the texture of the worn leather beneath her fingertips. Something about the book felt important, like it had been waiting for her all these years. Excited by her discovery, Sarah carefully opened the book, only to find that the pages were filled with strange symbols and a language she could not recognize. The text was written in a flowing script, unlike anything she had ever encountered in the books she had read. Each page seemed to contain cryptic phrases and bizarre illustrations, some of which depicted things Sarah couldn't even begin to understand. A world that seemed entirely foreign to her. Her first instinct was to show the book to her father, but something stopped her. There was a strange feeling that tugged at her heart, a sense that this book was meant for her alone, that it held secrets that no one else could uncover. As much as she trusted her father, Sarah knew that this discovery was hers to unravel. She couldn't explain why, but it felt as though the book was calling out to her in a way that was impossible to ignore. The conflict began to brew in that moment. Sarah realized that she had found something important, something that could change everything. Yet, despite her fascination with the book, she was left with a single, frustrating problem. She couldn't understand any of the words. The language was completely unfamiliar to her, a barrier that stood between her and the answers she so desperately wanted to find. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if the book was meant to be understood by someone else, someone more equipped to decipher its cryptic message. But Sarah wasn't someone who gave up easily. She had always prided herself on her ability to figure things out, and this puzzle was no different. She began researching the language, poring over old dictionaries and language books in the library. She even visited the local historian, hoping to find someone who could help her decipher the symbols. But no one knew the language, and Sarah began to feel as though the book was taunting her with its mysteries. It was a riddle she couldn't solve, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. As the days passed, Sarah became obsessed with the book. She spent every free moment trying to decode the symbols, convinced that if she could just unlock its meaning, she would discover something extraordinary. She started to have vivid dreams in which the book seemed to come alive, its pages turning on their own, revealing glimpses of the future, visions of events that hadn't yet happened. It was as though the book held the key to something far greater than Sarah could have ever imagined. But with each passing day, Sarah realized that the more she uncovered about the book, the deeper she fell into its mysteries, and the more she felt as though she was being drawn into something much bigger than herself. The conflict was no longer just about the language or the book itself. It was about what the book might mean, and the weight of the responsibility that came with discovering the truth behind its cryptic pages. What if this book could predict the future? What if it held the power to change everything Sarah had ever known? Sarah had unwittingly opened the door to a world of uncertainty, and now she had to face the consequences of what lay beyond. Sarah's days had become a blur of frustration and obsession. Each morning she would wake up early, her first instinct to rush to the attic and open the mysterious book. She had stopped seeing her friends, and her father's concerned glances grew more frequent. Still, nothing mattered more to her than unraveling the enigma of the old diary. She felt closer to it than to anyone else, as if the book was speaking to her in ways no one could understand. The cryptic symbols had started to feel like a personal challenge, something she had to overcome to make sense of her place in the world. One rainy evening, as she sat by her bedroom window, a strange unease settled over her. The air felt thick, and a chill crept down her spine, though the house was warm. It was one of those rare nights where even the usual hum of the world outside seemed muted. She stood up from her desk and walked over to the attic stairs, feeling the weight of the book in her hands like a heavy promise. As she reached the top of the stairs, the old wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet, their familiar sound filling the silence of the house. Sarah didn't know why she felt so on edge tonight, but something about the air in the attic felt different. The usual musty scent of old paper and dust lingered in the air, but tonight it seemed more oppressive. She pushed open the door to the attic, the hinges groaning in protest. The space felt darker than usual, the corners of the room cast in shadow, though the dim light from the single bulb above still illuminated the clutter. She walked over to the trunk where she had first found the book, her heart racing with the same eager anticipation she had felt on that first day. But this time, something was wrong. The trunk was open. Sarah froze. The lock on the trunk had been tampered with. It wasn't broken or missing, but it was open, slightly ajar. She had been the only one in the attic. She knew that for sure. Her father had been at work all day, and there was no way Arfa, her younger cousin, had come over. Arfa wasn't old enough to be left alone in the attic anyway. Her breath caught in her throat as she moved closer, her eyes scanning the trunk's interior. The book was gone. Panic surged through her chest. How could it have disappeared? She'd never let it out of her sight. Was it a mistake? Had she somehow imagined it being there in the first place? Just then, a creaking sound echoed behind her. Sarah spun around, her heart thudding in her ears. The attic was empty. No one was there. Yet, the feeling of being watched crawled along her skin. Her mind raced, trying to grasp at the fragments of logic that made sense. Maybe it was a prank. Perhaps a member of her family had taken the book without telling her. But as she checked every corner of the attic, every box and trunk, Sarah knew it wasn't a simple prank. This was something else. The air seemed to hum with a strange energy, and the shadows in the corners of the attic seemed to shift, as if alive. Suddenly, her gaze was drawn to a small slip of paper that lay near the corner of the trunk, half hidden beneath a pile of old fabrics. It was a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age, and covered in the same strange script from the book. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, unfolding it with care. The paper was covered in more of the same symbols, but at the bottom of the page, there was something different, a series of numbers. The numbers were unmistakable. She recognized them immediately as dates. The first date was today's date. The second was in a week. The third, a month later. Each date was followed by a phrase that made Sarah's stomach twist with confusion and dread. The end will begin when the moon wanes. Sarah's mind whirled. What did this mean? And who had written this note? Could it have been the same person who had written in the book? Was someone else involved in this mystery? Someone who knew about the diary and its strange predictions? Before she could process the full weight of the note, her phone buzzed loudly in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out, her hands shaking. It was a message from her father. Sarah, I need you to come down immediately. Something strange has happened. Sarah's pulse quickened. She didn't need to ask what he meant. She had the unsettling feeling that whatever it was connected to the book. Her mind raced as she sprinted down the attic stairs, nearly tripping over her own feet. When she reached the kitchen, her father was standing by the back door, his face pale, eyes wide with concern. In his hand, he held something that made Sarah's breath catch, an envelope, its edges burnt and singed as if it had been through some sort of fire. I found this outside, her father said, his voice low. It was lying on the porch, covered in ash. I thought it was a prank at first, but I'm not so sure anymore. Sarah took the envelope, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside, there was another piece of parchment, covered in the same symbols that had haunted the pages of the book. But this time, there was no date. Instead, the message was clear and unmistakable. She will unlock the path. The moon will guide her. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. The same symbols, the same cryptic message, but now it was clear. Whatever the book had foretold, whatever mystery it held, it was no longer just hers to solve. Someone, or something, was watching, and it was directing events beyond her control. Her father's voice broke her from her thoughts. "Sarah, what's going on? What's happening?" "I don't know, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I think I'm being watched. Someone else knows about the book." Her father's brow furrowed. "Who? And why would anyone?" "I don't know," Sarah interrupted, her heart pounding in her chest. "But this book, it's connected to something bigger. I don't understand it all, but I have to find out." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Sarah realized that this was no longer just a mystery about an old book. This was about her family, and a future she couldn't yet comprehend. The peaceful life she had known was slipping away, replaced by the certainty that someone, was drawing her into a web of fate and mystery that was beyond her control. The days that followed the discovery of the strange note and the mysterious envelope only deepened Sarah's sense of unease. Her father, though still unsure of what to make of her findings, seemed more concerned than ever. He began checking the house more frequently, locking doors and windows with a heightened sense of urgency. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced by a look of suspicion, as though he too had begun to feel that something out of the ordinary was unfolding around them. Despite her father's growing wariness, Sarah was resolute. She knew that the discovery of the book and the cryptic messages weren't random. They were part of something much bigger. And she, whether she was ready or not, had been chosen to play a role in it. But even as she delved deeper into the mystery of the book, Sarah realized that the more she uncovered, the more she was confronted by dangers she hadn't anticipated. At night, she would wake up in cold sweats, the echoes of her dreams lingering in her mind like fragments of a nightmare. In these dreams, the book was always just out of reach, and the words she could not understand seemed to pulse and shift, mocking her attempts to decipher them. In one particularly vivid dream, she saw herself standing in a dark, foggy forest, with towering figures lurking in the shadows. They whispered her name, beckoning her deeper into the mist, but when she tried to run, she found her legs frozen, unable to move. The tension in the house was palpable. Her father insisted on taking more precautions, locking all the doors and windows every night, checking every corner of the house as if expecting something or someone to break in. Sarah found herself growing more restless, spending hours in her room or the attic, searching for more clues, but she was running out of options. The strange language in the book had not yielded any answers, no matter how much she tried to study it. Yet, with each passing day, the sense of urgency grew stronger. It was as if time was running out. One afternoon, as Sarah was scouring the old library for any mention of the book, she received an unexpected visit. The knock on the door was light, almost tentative, but it still sent a wave of unease through her. When she opened the door, she was startled to find the figure of an elderly man standing there, his face lined with wrinkles and his eyes dark, almost unreadable. He wore a faded cloak that seemed out of place for the warm afternoon, and his hands trembled slightly as he held out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I've been following your progress," he said, his voice low and raspy. "You're looking for answers, but you're not the only one." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Who was this man? How did he know what she was looking for? "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. "My name is Elias," the man replied, his gaze never leaving her face. "I know about the book. I know what it holds." Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to trust him, but something about his presence felt both comforting and ominous. She stepped aside and allowed him into the house, wondering if she had just invited a stranger, or worse, an enemy, into her life. "I've spent many years studying ancient texts," Elias continued, sitting down at the kitchen table. "The book you found, it's not just a relic. It holds knowledge that many would do anything to possess. You're not the only one searching for it." Sarah's pulse quickened as she sat across from him. "What do you mean? Who else is looking for it?" Elias leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There are others who have spent decades searching for the book, but they've been too late every time. Now they know you've found it." Sarah's heart raced. She had known something wasn't right, but hearing it from this man made it feel all too real. She was being watched, and the people watching her didn't seem to have good intentions. Elias continued, his eyes dark with concern. "You have to be careful. These people, they won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to get their hands on the book. You can't trust anyone who comes to you offering help. The book is part of an ancient prophecy, one that can change the course of everything." The mention of the prophecy sent a cold shiver through Sarah. It was becoming clearer that the stakes were much higher than she had imagined. But what was the prophecy? And why was she the one chosen to unlock its secrets? Just then, a sharp knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Sarah's heart skipped. Elias's eyes darted to the door, and he stood up quickly, his expression shifting from concern to something darker. "Don't open it," he whispered urgently. "They're here." Sarah's mind raced. She wasn't sure who Elias meant, but she didn't need an explanation. She had already heard the faint whispers of footsteps outside. Someone was watching. And whoever it was, they weren't friendly. Elias grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back door, his grip surprisingly strong for his age. "Come on, we need to leave now." Sarah hesitated for only a moment, but then she realized there was no time to waste. She followed Elias through the back door and into the garden, her heart hammering in her chest. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. The air felt heavy, thick with the promise of danger. As they ran toward the woods behind the house, Sarah could hear the creak of the front door opening. There was no turning back now. She had been thrust into a world she hadn't prepared for, and it was clear that there were people, dangerous people, who would stop at nothing to claim the book and its power. They didn't get far before a figure appeared from the shadows, stepping into their path. A tall man, clad in black, his face hidden by a hood. He held a glinting knife in his hand, and his eyes shone with an unsettling intensity. "Stop," the man said in a low, menacing voice. "Give us the book, and no one has to get hurt." Elias stepped in front of Sarah, his hands raised in a protective gesture. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he warned. "The book isn't just a tool to be used. It's a key. If you open it, you'll unleash something far worse than you can imagine." The man laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "We're not afraid of legends, old man. Hand over the book." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The stakes were higher than she had imagined. Her heart raced as she realized that the path she had stepped onto was far more dangerous than she had ever expected. And the real test was only just beginning. With Elias beside her, Sarah made a split-second decision. She ran, knowing that every step was a risk, but also knowing that if she didn't act now, it might be too late. The chase had begun. The forest around Sarah and Elias was thick with the heavy scent of pine and damp earth, the air pulsing with the silence of impending danger. The man in black was behind them, his footsteps quick and calculated, his breath barely audible as he pursued them through the trees. The only sound breaking the stillness was the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot and the frantic rhythm of Sarah's heart. They had been running for what felt like hours, with no sign of the man slowing his pursuit. The woods, once familiar to Sarah as a peaceful retreat, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows. Every path seemed to lead deeper into the unknown, but still they kept running. She glanced over at Elias, his face drawn with a mixture of determination and fear. The old man's earlier confidence had given way to a more desperate urgency. He knew more than he had let on, but what did he know about the dangers they were facing, and how had he been involved with the book for so long? "Elias," Sarah gasped, her lungs burning. "What's going on?" "Who are these people?" Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he pushed forward, his eyes scanning the trees as though he were looking for something specific. Finally, after a moment of silence, he spoke, his voice strained. "They're part of an ancient order. They've been hunting the book for generations. They believe it holds the power to change the world, to control it. If they get their hands on it, there's no telling what they'll do." Sarah's mind raced. It had always been more than just an old book, but hearing it from Elias made the danger feel all too real. The stakes were no longer just about her. She was caught in a battle for something far greater than herself, something that could change everything. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. She knew they didn't have much time. The man was gaining on them, and the path ahead was becoming more difficult to navigate, the dense underbrush slowing their movement. Sarah glanced around desperately, searching for a way out, some way to stop the man from catching them. Without warning, Elias veered off the main path, pulling her along with him. "This way," he urged, his voice urgent. They scrambled through the thicket, the branches scraping at their skin. The trail was difficult to follow, but Elias seemed to know where he was going. Sarah followed blindly, her mind consumed with the image of the man in black, now just a few steps behind them. Then they stumbled into a clearing, a small, hidden grove that Sarah had never seen before. In the center of the grove was an ancient stone altar, weathered by time and overgrown with ivy. It was a strange sight, out of place among the trees, as though it had been forgotten by the world. The moment they stepped into the clearing, a strange sensation washed over Sarah, a sudden feeling of connection, as though the very ground beneath her feet was charged with energy. "This is it," Elias said, his voice low and reverent. "This is where it all started." Sarah felt a strange tug in her chest, as though the book, wherever it was calling to her. The air was thick with tension, charged with something ancient and powerful. It felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, a harsh voice broke through the quiet. "Stop right there." The man in black stepped into the clearing, his eyes locked onto them, his body rigid with purpose. He held a gun in his hand, the cold steel glinting in the fading light. His face was shadowed, but Sarah could see the malice in his eyes. There was no hesitation in his movement, no sign of mercy. He was determined to get the book, no matter what. "Give it to me," the man demanded, his voice sharp, cutting through the stillness of the grove. "Now." Elias stepped forward, positioning himself between Sarah and the man. "You don't understand," he said, his voice steady despite the threat. "The book is not meant for you. It's meant for someone else. Someone who can wield its power without destroying the world." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Was Elias talking about her? Did he mean that she was the one meant to wield the power of the book? The man's lips curled into a sneer. "You old fool. You think you can stop me? I've waited too long for this. The book will be mine." Before Elias could respond, the man raised the gun, aiming it directly at him. Sarah's heart stopped. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let him kill Elias, someone who had been trying to protect her, trying to help her understand the danger she was in. Without thinking, Sarah moved. She grabbed a heavy branch from the ground, her fingers slipping around the rough bark, and swung it with all her strength. The impact landed squarely on the man's wrist, knocking the gun out of his hand. He staggered back, cursing under his breath, and reached for a knife at his side. But the delay had given them just enough time. Elias wasted no time. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the altar. The man's shouts echoed in the distance, but they didn't look back. They had no choice now but to move forward, into whatever lay ahead. "Stay close to me," Elias warned, his voice tense. "The altar holds the key. It's the only way we can stop him." Sarah's mind was racing. What did he mean by the altar holding the key? She had no time to ask, no time to process. She had to act. As they reached the altar, the ground seemed to shake beneath their feet. The air crackled with energy, and Sarah felt a sudden compulsion to approach the stone. The book. She needed to find the book. Elias stood by her side, his eyes filled with both fear and hope. "This is it, Sarah. You have to do it. You have to unlock the power." With trembling hands, Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing the surface of the stone. The moment she touched it, a surge of energy coursed through her, and the symbols from the book, those strange, indecipherable markings, began to glow in her mind. The words she had struggled with for so long suddenly made sense. They were instructions she now understood. The world around her seemed to fall away as she focused, her mind locked on the task at hand. She had to open the portal, had to use the power in the book to stop the man, to stop everything from unraveling. The fate of everything rested on this one moment. The man's voice broke through her concentration, but it sounded distant now, muffled. He was getting closer, but it didn't matter. Sarah raised her hand, her heart pounding, and the symbols on the altar flared with light. A powerful force erupted from the stone, a blast of energy that knocked the man back, sending him sprawling to the ground. Sarah stumbled, exhausted, but the clearing was silent now. The man in black lay motionless, his body disoriented, and Elias rushed to her side, supporting her as the energy dissipated. "You did it," Elias said, his voice filled with awe. Sarah looked down at the altar, now quiet and still. The book was no longer in her hands. It had disappeared, as though it had never been there at all. The mystery was no longer hers to solve, but for the first time, Sarah felt a sense of peace. The burden had been lifted. The world around them was silent, as though holding its breath. They had won, for now. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The real journey was yet to come. The quiet that followed the eruption of light from the altar felt surreal. For a moment, Sarah could hardly breathe, the overwhelming weight of what had just happened pressing down on her chest. She blinked, her eyes still trying to adjust to the dimming forest, the aftershocks of the energy that had just surged through her body, reverberating in her limbs. Elias stood beside her, his grip firm on her arm, his face unreadable. His gaze shifted between the motionless man on the ground and the now calm altar, and he let out a long, relieved breath. "You did it, Sarah. You actually did it." His voice was full of awe, but there was something more there, something like recognition, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Sarah turned to him, her mind still racing, her heart hammering in her chest. "Is it over? Is he—" Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he knelt beside the man in black, checking for signs of life. For a moment, Sarah feared he might be dead, and then Elias's voice broke through the tense silence. "He's still breathing, barely. I don't think he'll be getting up anytime soon." Elias rose to his feet and looked at her seriously. "But we need to leave. We can't stay here." Sarah's legs felt like they might give way under her, but she nodded. The sense of danger hadn't entirely dissipated, and they couldn't risk staying in the open for too long. The clearing was still too exposed, too vulnerable. Elias quickly pulled Sarah away from the altar, urging her toward the tree line. As they walked, the weight of everything that had just transpired settled over her, and she found herself struggling to process the enormity of the moment. The man had been defeated. But what did that really mean? What did it mean for the book, the prophecy, and her place in all of this? Sarah had never asked for any of this, never imagined that she would be caught up in a struggle that reached beyond her comprehension. But now, standing on the edge of the woods, the echoes of the power she had unleashed still pulsing in her veins, she couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. The worst was over, or so it seemed. They didn't speak as they made their way through the dense woods, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles beneath them. The world felt different now, more alive, almost as if the very air had changed. The trees around them seemed taller, the shadows deeper. There was a sense of something ancient, something that had always been there, finally stirring to life. As they reached the edge of the forest, Sarah glanced back at the clearing one last time. The altar stood silent, no longer pulsing with energy, but still carrying the weight of what had happened. She felt an undeniable sense of loss. That place had been a pivotal part of her journey, a journey that, despite all the fear and uncertainty, had led her to discover strength she never knew she had. And yet, she knew that her path was far from over. The book might be gone, but there was more to this story than just its power. There were still questions left unanswered, and Sarah was determined to find the truth. They reached the edge of the town just as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of gold and orange. The quiet of the morning felt almost like a promise, a reprieve from the storm they had just weathered. Once they were safely back at the house, Elias took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "We should be safe here for now," he said. "The man in black. He's only one part of a much larger threat, but for today, we've won." Sarah nodded, but the relief that she had expected didn't come. She was still too caught up in the magnitude of everything that had happened. The book, the prophecy, the powers it held, and the people who were willing to kill for it. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do next?" Elias's eyes softened as he looked at her. "We move forward. The book might be gone, but it was never the only key. There are other ways to stop the people who seek its power, and I have a feeling you're going to play a big role in that." Sarah swallowed hard. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and she realized that her life had changed irrevocably. There was no going back to the way things were before. She had a purpose now, one that she couldn't ignore, no matter how daunting it seemed. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm yet comforting. "You're not alone in this, Sarah. We'll figure this out together, and we'll protect what needs protecting, no matter the cost." Sarah met his gaze, and for the first time in a long while she felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She had been thrust into a world of mystery and danger, but now She had allies, people she could trust. Over the next few days, they kept a low profile, monitoring the situation and staying alert for any signs of the man's return or others like him. The authorities had no idea what had truly happened, and neither Sarah nor Elias were eager to explain. For now, their priority was keeping the book's secrets safe and keeping themselves out of danger. Sarah's relationship with Elias deepened over the following weeks. The more they spoke about the book and its origins, the more Sarah understood that her journey was far from over. There were still so many unknowns, so many dangers lurking just beyond the horizon. But Elias, despite the weight of his own burden, remained a steady guide. Together, they began to piece together the puzzle, slowly uncovering more of the story behind the book, the prophecy, and the dark forces that sought it. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, their conversation shifted to the future. "Do you think we'll ever find out who else is after the book?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet. Elias didn't answer right away, but when he did, his words carried a quiet resolve. "They're out there, and they'll stop at nothing to find it again. But we'll be ready. We have something they don't, a purpose that they can't see." Sarah thought about that for a moment, then nodded. "I can't go back to my old life, not now, but maybe I wasn't meant to. Maybe this is what I was always supposed to do." Elias smiled, a faint, knowing smile. Perhaps. The world works in mysterious ways. The days ahead would not be easy. The challenges would be greater, the dangers even more intense. But Sarah had come a long way since the day she first discovered the book. She had uncovered a power within herself, one that she would not let go to waste. And with Elias by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. Together, they would continue the journey that had begun with a single, mysterious book, and together, they would stop the forces that sought to control it. The future was uncertain, but Sarah no longer feared it. She was ready for whatever came her way. Months had passed since the night of the man in black, since the energy had erupted from the altar and sent them scrambling for safety. The woods were quieter now, the leaves having settled into a blanket of autumn gold. The dangers that had loomed so large over Sarah now seemed distant, though the quiet in her soul had yet to match the peace that had come with the victory. The world felt different, as if it had shifted its axis, subtle yet undeniable. Sarah still could not comprehend the full magnitude of her role in this unfolding tale, but she had learned to live with its weight. She sat at the small wooden table in Elias's home, a modest cottage hidden deep in the woods. The flickering light of the hearth danced across the walls, casting long shadows in the corners of the room. Elias sat opposite her, poring over ancient texts, his brow furrowed in concentration. The glow of the fire softened his features, giving him an almost ethereal quality. Despite the weeks they had spent in this quiet refuge, the journey had only just begun. Sarah's fingers traced the spine of the book in front of her, its leather cover worn but still intact. The book was no longer a mystery to her. The strange symbols that had once seemed foreign were now part of her world. She had unlocked its secrets, had deciphered its hidden knowledge. But it was clear now that the book, though powerful, was merely a key, a part of something larger. "We found only fragments," Elias said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, thoughtful. "But there's more. The people who sought the book, they were part of a much older order, and the truth behind it is buried deeper than we imagined." Sarah nodded, her fingers still tracing the book's edges. She had learned that the book was more than a physical object. It was a map to something far older, something more ancient and powerful than anything she could have understood before. The order that had pursued them, those shadowy figures that had stopped at nothing to possess the book, was still out there, waiting, watching. But Sarah was no longer afraid. They had gone through a lot together. Elias had become not just her guide, but her mentor, someone who had taught her to trust in herself, in her own abilities. The fear that had initially gripped her was now replaced with resolve. She knew what she had to do. Elias glanced up from his studies, meeting her gaze. "You've come a long way, Sarah. We're not finished yet, but you've grown. You've changed." Sarah smiled faintly, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Something steady, something unshakable. "I don't think I could have done it without you," she said, her voice quieter than usual, but sincere. Elias leaned back in his chair, a rare expression of warmth on his face. "You did the work. I only helped you find your way. And now the real work begins. We can't run forever. The order will come again, and this time we'll be ready." Sarah's heart raced as she thought about the days ahead. The final confrontation was drawing closer, but she no longer saw it as an obstacle. She had learned to face challenges head-on, to accept that she might not have all the answers, but that she could find them along the way. The knowledge the book had given her, its power, its wisdom, was not for her alone. It was meant to be shared, to protect those who needed it most. The fire crackled, and Sarah stared into the flames, a sense of purpose growing within her. She had once been an ordinary woman with an ordinary life, lost in the hustle and bustle of a world that seemed far too large for her. But now her world had shrunk, her purpose had focused, and she knew her path was leading her toward something monumental. She had learned so much about herself, about the balance of light and darkness that existed within her. The events of the past months had revealed her own strength, her resilience, and her courage. She had stood against forces that sought to control the very world she knew, and she had emerged victorious. But she knew there would be more battles. The journey was far from over. Elias broke her reverie. "I've made arrangements for us. We'll need to move on soon. The Order will not stop hunting us. It's only a matter of time before they catch up. But we can't let them win." Sarah straightened in her chair. She was ready now, ready to face whatever came next. She no longer felt the anxiety that had once gripped her, no longer saw herself as a victim of circumstance. She had become a force to be reckoned with. And yet, as the days passed, and the time to move on grew closer, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the changes within her. She thought back to the moment when she had first discovered the book, that moment of confusion, of fear. She had been scared then, uncertain of her place in the world, but now she felt grounded, rooted in something deeper than herself. It wasn't just the book or the knowledge it held that had transformed her. It was the realization that she had a purpose, a reason to stand up and fight for what was right. As Elias prepared for their next move, Sarah made her way to the door, stepping outside into the cool evening air. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a soft glow over the trees, and she felt the familiar whisper of the wind against her skin. She took a deep breath, savoring the calm, and for the first time in a long time, felt truly at peace. In the distance, she could hear the sound of the forest, gentle, almost melodic, as if the world itself were speaking to her. The path ahead was unclear, but she no longer feared it. With each step she took, she knew that she was growing stronger, more certain of her place in this vast and unpredictable world. The journey was just beginning. There would be more challenges, more dangers. but Sarah was no longer the same person who had picked up the book all those months ago. She had learned to trust in her instincts, to believe in herself. And now, as she stood at the threshold of a new chapter in her life, she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. Elias joined her outside, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "You're ready?" he said, his voice calm but full of conviction. "I knew you would be." Sarah turned to him, a sense of gratitude filling her heart. "I couldn't have done it without you. But I think I've found my own strength." Elias nodded. "That's what I've been waiting to see." Together, they turned away from the house and began walking toward the unknown. The future was still uncertain, but Sarah no longer feared it. She had found the courage to face whatever lay ahead. As the moonlight bathed the path in front of them, Sarah realized that the greatest lesson she had learned was not the knowledge within the book or the power she had unlocked. It was the realization that no matter how dark the world might seem, there was always light to guide her forward. And with that knowledge, she was ready to continue her journey wherever it would take her.